The colony had a rule about scouting parties. You come back together, or you don't come back at all. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. 3 years under occupation had a way of turning unspoken understandings into law. And the law was simple. The wasteland didn't give people back. So when Hunter walked to the eastern gate at dawn alone, with dry blood on his jacket that wasn't his and nothing behind him but empty road and silence, the 2 sentries on watch didn't say a word. They just looked past him, the way you look past something you don't want to be real. He told them anyway. Told them about the ambush, the patrol route, the point where everything went wrong. He kept his voice level, because falling apart wasn't going to help anyone, and he had learned a long time ago that emotion in a crisis was a luxury that got people killed. The sentries listened. One of them, a younger man named Dex, had a brother on that patrol. Hunter watched the information land on him and didn't look away because he owed the kid that much at least. Then he went inside to tell the rest. The colony occupied what had once been a regional water treatment facility on the edge of a mid-sized city that no longer existed in any meaningful way. The aliens had not destroyed it so much as emptied it, moving through the urban corridors in the early months of the occupation with the kind of systematic efficiency that left buildings standing and people gone. The colony had moved into the facility 14 months ago, about 60 people at that point. Now closer to 80 with the additions picked up from smaller groups that hadn't survived on their own. It was not comfortable, it was not safe, but it had thick concrete walls, a defensible perimeter, and access to a water source that still ran clean, which put ahead of most alternatives. Hunter had been part of it from nearly the beginning. He knew most of the 80 people by name and all of them by face, and he had made the walk from the eastern gate to the main hall dozens of times, but this particular morning it felt like a different distance entirely. Word moved faster than he did. By the time he pushed through the heavy door into the main hall, people already knew something had happened. He could tell by the way the room shifted when he entered, the subtle collective reorientation of a group that has been waiting for bad news and just identified its source. He stood at the front of the room, and he told them about the patrol, 7 people, names he listed one by one, because they deserved to be named out loud. He told them about the route, the checkpoint, the moment the aliens had appeared not from the direction the scouts were watching, but from 3 directions simultaneously in a way that suggested patrol had been tracked before it ever left the facility. He told them it was fast. He told them there was nothing that could have been done differently once it started. He told them he didn't know why he made it out, and they didn't. That last part was the truth. He genuinely did not know. He had his condition. The thing his body did sometimes, the slowing, the drop, the way his heart rate and temperature would fall so low that it scared 2 different doctors in his life into thinking he had died on the table. It had been happening since childhood, irregular and unannounced, and he had learned to manage it the way you manage anything that is simply part of you, carefully and without much discussion. Whether it had anything to do with what happened on that hillside, he couldn't say. He only knew that when the chaos started, he had dropped behind a concrete barrier, and his body had done the thing it sometimes did. And when he came back to himself, the aliens were gone, and his people were not. He did not include this detail in what he told the colony. It wasn't relevant, and it wasn't something he knew how to explain, and more than that, it felt private in a way he couldn't articulate, like something that belonged to him, and not the room full of grieving people trying to make sense of a loss that didn't make sense. The questions came after. He answered them all. Some were practical. What did he see of the alien patrol formation? How many units? What direction did they move after? Hunter answered those clearly and completely because that information mattered, and the colony's survival depended on people having accurate intelligence. Some questions were not practical. Some questions were the kind that grief asks when it needs somewhere to put itself. He answered those too, as honestly as he could. And he stayed in that room until the questions ran out and the silence that replaced them made it clear that his presence was no longer helping anything. He left the hall and went to his bunk and sat on the edge of it for a while, without moving. The facility hummed around in the way it always did, the low mechanical sound of the water systems running, the distant voices of people in other sections, the ordinary sounds of 80 people trying to maintain something like a life in a building that had never been designed for living. He ate something he didn't taste and slept for a few hours and woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. The shift was gradual. He noticed it first at meals, which was where you notice most things in a place that small. The table that had always fit him, without comment, suddenly didn't seem to have room. Not overtly. Nobody told him to move. It was more that people arranged themselves in a way that left him at one end with space around him that shouldn't have been there given how tightly 80 people were packed into a facility built for a staff of 20. He noticed it in conversations, too. He would approach a group and the conversation would continue, but at a slightly different register. The way people talk when they are aware of being observed. Eye contact shortened. Responses shortened. The natural rhythm of belonging that you don't notice until it's gone began to develop gaps. He understood it. He did not blame anyone for it. Grief needed somewhere to go, and he was the most available surface. He was the one who came back. He was the one still walking around with the same face he'd always had, while 7 other people did not walk around at all anymore. And every time someone looked at him, they saw the gap where those people used to be. He was a reminder, a daily, breathing, walking reminder that the patrol had gone out and most of it hadn't returned. And as long as he was here, that reminder wasn't going away. Understanding it didn't make it easier to live inside of, he gave it 2 weeks. 2 weeks of shortened conversations and rearranged meal tables, and in particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who had decided, without malice and without meeting, that you are too painful to be near. Then he started thinking about leaving. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no single moment of clarity, no confrontation that pushed him over an edge. It was more like a slow accumulation, a weight that kept adding to itself until one morning he woke up and realized that staying was costing him more than he had left to spend, and that the colony might actually function better without the daily reminder of what it had lost walking its hallways. He thought about it for 3 more days. He made a list in his head of what he would take, and what he would leave, and what he knew about surviving in the wasteland beyond the facility's walls, which was more than most people and less than he would need. He thought about the alien patrol patterns he had observed over 14 months of scouting. He thought about water sources and supply caches and the rough geography of the region. He thought about the fact that he had no real destination and no realistic plan beyond surviving the first week, and he decided that was going to have to be enough. He left on a Thursday. It seemed as good a day as any. He was packed and moving before the early watch changed, slipping out through the maintenance exit on the north side of the facility that he knew the sentries covered less carefully than the main gates. He didn't leave a note. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like either an accusation or an apology, and he didn't feel either of those things. He felt tired and he felt ready, which were not the same as okay, but were functional. The wasteland received him without ceremony. Cold morning air, gray sky, the distant low hum that had become the ambient soundtrack of a world under occupation. He oriented himself north and started walking and didn't look back because looking back was a habit he had been trying to break for most of his adult life, and this seemed like a reasonable time to make progress on it. He walked for 6 hours before he stopped to rest, putting as much distance between himself and the facility as the terrain allowed. The landscape out here was a mixture of overgrown suburban sprawl and open industrial corridors, the kind of geography that offered decent cover if you moved carefully and knew what to look for. He had mapped most of this region on previous scouting runs, and he moved through it with a practiced economy of someone who had learned that energy spent carelessly was energy you didn't have later. He was 3 weeks out when he found the wolf. He had been following what used to be a highway overpass, using the elevated structure to get a sight line on the area ahead, checking for patrol activity before committing to crossing the open ground below. The wolf was at the base of one of the support columns, half hidden by a collapsed section of guardrail. Female, large, and recently dead. Her body was still carrying warmth when he crouched beside her, and he scanned the area automatically, reading the signs. No obvious alien activity, but the grass nearby was disturbed in a pattern he recognized, the edge of a sweet path, the kind of lateral search pattern the ground units used when they were clearing a sector. She had been in the wrong place. He started to stand, and then stopped. The sound was so faint he almost missed it. He went still and listened and heard again, a thin, reedy sound from behind a concrete slab 3 feet to his left. He moved the slab. 4 pups, 3 of them gone, curled against each other in the stillness of things that had never really had a chance. The 4th was white, improbably white against the gray concrete in the gray morning, small enough to fit in one hand, and making the kind of sound that something makes when it is trying very hard to exist against considerable odds. Hunter looked at it for a long moment. He looked at the dead mother and the dead siblings and the living world outside that had very little interest in the survival of one white wolf pup in the wreckage, a highway overpass. Then he picked it up, tucked it inside his jacket against the warmth of his chest, and kept walking. He didn't name it right away. He wasn't sure naming it was a good idea, that it would survive the week, that he was capable of keeping something else alive when his own survival was still an open question. But by the 4th day, when the pup had eaten mashed ration paste from his finger and slept curled under his chin and started making a different sound, less desperate, more present, he decided naming it was unavoidable. Ghost, he thought, looking at the white fur and the gray world around them. It fit. The first month was the hardest. Not because of the aliens, though they were everywhere in a way that a permanent weather system is everywhere. Present, shaping everything, occasionally violent. The first month was hard because of the logistics of keeping a newborn wolf alive in a wasteland that was indifferent to both of them. Ghost needed warmth, and he needed feeding every few hours, and he needed the kind of attention that Hunter had not anticipated when he picked him up from that concrete slab and made the unspoken decision that this particular small life was worth the effort. Hunter had field experience with survival rations and water sourcing, and moving through occupied territory without drawing attention, but he had no experience with wolf pups and had to improvise almost everything. He chewed ration food into a paste and fed it to Ghost from his fingertip. He kept the pup inside his jacket during movement and against his side during sleep. He sourced water carefully and warmed it before giving it to the pup, watching for signs of illness or failure with the same vigilance he gave alien patrol routes. Ghost was stubborn in the way that surviving things tend to be stubborn. He ate badly and then ate better. He shivered and then stopped shivering. His eyes opened on the 9th day, pale gray, unfocused, blinking at a world that had not done him any favors yet. And Hunter found himself experiencing something that took him a moment to identify as relief, not the tactical relief of a threat passing. Something quieter than that, something he hadn't felt in a while. They moved slowly in those early weeks. Hunter had no fixed destination and no reason to push hard, and Ghost needs to impose a rhythm on the days that Hunter gradually stopped resisting. Rest periods, feeding times, the small rituals of keeping something alive that gradually became the structure around which everything else was organized. He found a defensible shelter in the ruins of a commercial district about 4 days from where he had found Ghost. A basement storage room beneath what had been a hardware store, accessible through a collapsed section of floor that was easy to miss if you didn't know to look. It was dry and it was enclosed and it had multiple exit points, which were the 3 things Hunter prioritized in any shelter situation. He stayed there for 3 weeks, longer than he had intended, longer than was strategically ideal. But Ghost was not ready to move at pace, and Hunter made the calculation that stability was worth the risk. He used the time to reorganize his supplies, scout the immediate area in careful increments, and map the patrol patterns he could observe from the shelter's upper vantage points. The aliens moved through this district on a loose rotation, 2 ground units working a grid pattern every 36 hours or so, with aerial surveillance passing over at irregular intervals that Hunter spent considerable effort trying to make sense of. He filled a small notebook with observations, times, directions, behaviors. Old habit from his scouting days. Data was survival. During those 3 weeks, Ghost grew at a rate that Hunter found mildly alarming. He had not had a clear sense of how old the pup was when he found him, but the growth suggested he had been newborn or very close to it. And by the end of the 3rd week, he was visibly larger, more coordinated, and significantly louder than Hunter would have preferred given their circumstances. He began working on that immediately, not harshly. He had no interest in breaking the animal spirit, which he suspected would be counterproductive in any case. But consistently, quiet meant safe. Quiet was the first lesson. Ghost learned it with a pragmatic intelligence that Hunter would come to recognize as characteristic. Not instant compliance, but a period of apparent consideration followed by behavioral adjustment, as though the wolf was running his own assessment of whether the instruction made sense before deciding to follow it. Hunter found this unreasonably reassuring. When they finally moved on from the hardware store, it was because Hunter had identified a supply cache he knew about from his scouting days, a location the colony had stocked as an emergency resource, far enough from the facility that he felt comfortable using it without feeling like he was taking from people who needed it. The route there took them through 3 sectors of varying alien activity, and it was on the 2nd sector, crossing a stretch of open ground between 2 collapsed residential blocks, that the first patrol encounter happened. Hunter had seen the unit from a distance and had made the call to cross anyway, calculating that he could time the gap in their sweep pattern and clear the open ground before they looped back. He was most of the way across when the calculation proved wrong, and the patrol appeared from an unexpected angle, closer than he had anticipated, moving faster than the pattern suggested they should. He stopped moving. There was no cover close enough to reach. He stood in open ground with Ghost at his feet, and the alien patrol unit approximately 40 meters away and moving his direction, and he experienced a very specific kind of clarity that extreme danger sometimes produces. Not calm exactly, but sharpening, an absolute presence in a moment that pushed everything else to the edges. He stayed still. Ghost stayed still beside him, which Hunter registered distantly as remarkable given that Ghost was for weeks old and had not been trained in any formal sense. The patrol moved, its scanning equipment, the forward-facing array that the units use to sweep for human biosignatures, passed over Hunter's position. He had seen that equipment work before. He had seen it light up and vector a unit directly toward a heat signature from 300 meters. It did not light up now. The unit's trajectory did not change. It moved through its sweep pattern with the mechanical consistency of something following a program, and it passed within 30 meters of where Hunter stood and Ghost sat, and it did not stop, and it did not turn, and then it was past him and continuing its grid, and Hunter was still standing in open ground with his heart doing something complicated in his chest. He moved. He covered the remaining distance to the residential blocks and got himself and Ghost into cover, and then stood against the cold concrete wall, breathing carefully and thinking about what had just happened. He had not been seen. He had been in open ground in daylight at 30 meters, and a piece of alien detection technology that he had watched locate a man hiding under a vehicle at 200 meters had passed over him without response. He ran through the possibilities. Malfunction, interference from local materials, some error in the sweep pattern. He did not let himself land on the most significant possibility yet, because landing on it prematurely felt dangerous, like building on a foundation you hadn't tested properly. He needed more data. He got more data over the following weeks. He began paying attention in a different way during patrol encounters, stop his instinct to immediately seek cover, and instead giving himself an extra 2 or 3 seconds of exposure before moving, observing the scanner response, cataloging what happened. What happened was consistently nothing. The scanners passed over him. The units did not respond. Ghost, sitting or standing, or occasionally attempting to engage Hunter's bootlace with his teeth during these tense experimental moments, drew equally zero response. By the time they had been in the wasteland for a 2-month, Hunter had enough data to say with reasonable confidence that the alien detection equipment could not find him. He still didn't know why. He had his condition, the slowing, the drop in temperature and pulse, and every other measurable sign of biological activity, and was the only variable he could identify that made him different from every other human being the alien scanners had apparently located with efficient precision. He had lived with the condition his entire life, and had never considered it anything other than an occasional inconvenience and a reliable way to frighten medical personnel. The idea that it might function as a form of invisibility to whatever technology the aliens were using to hunt humanity was not something he had frameworks for. He sat with it. He turned it over. He did not arrive at certainty, but he arrived at working hypothesis, which was enough to start building from. Ghost, for his part, had opinions about most of what Hunter was doing, and expressed them through a developing vocabulary of sounds and behaviors that Hunter found himself learning with the same systematic attention he gave to alien patrol patterns. By 3 months out, Ghost was no longer a pup in any practical sense. He was a half-grown wolf with strong opinions about the pace of travel, the quality of available food, and the appropriate response to unfamiliar smells, which was apparently always to investigate aggressively and then report back by sitting on Hunter's feet. He was not yet trained in any formal way. That came later, gradually, built out of the same consistency and repetition that Hunter applied to everything. Not commands, but communication. Not obedience, but understanding. The slow construction of a shared language between two creatures who had both ended up alone in a hostile world and made the practical decision to be less alone together. By the end of the first year, Ghost could move on signal. Stop, go, slow, stay, come, and had developed his own set of alerts that Hunter had learned to read. The particular stillness that meant alien activity in the near vicinity. The low shift in posture that meant something worth investigating. The press of his body against Hunter's leg that meant they needed to move now without discussion. Hunter could not have articulated when exactly the wolf stopped being something he was keeping alive and started being the thing that was keeping him alive in return. It happened somewhere in the middle of all the other things that were happening. The moving and surviving, and the slow accumulation of knowledge about a world that most of its remaining inhabitants were hiding from rather than learning. He thought about the colonies sometimes, not with bitterness, which surprised him a little, more with a detached awareness of someone observing something from a distance too great to change. He understood what happened and why, and had made his peace with the fact that grief was not rational, and that people in survival situations did not always behave the way they would have chosen to under better circumstances. He hoped they were okay. He hoped Dex had found some way to carry what he was carrying. He hoped the facility's water systems were still holding. These were not actionable thoughts, and he did not spend excessive time on them, but he did not push them away either. They were part of the honest accounting of where he was and how he had gotten there, and Hunter had always believed that honest accounting, even when uncomfortable, was more useful than the alternative. The wasteland had a particular quality in the late evenings when the alien aerial units were between patrol cycles, and the light dropped to a specific shade of orange that Hunter had never seen before the occupation. He suspected it was related to whatever the alien infrastructure was doing to the atmosphere in the occupied zones. He had stopped finding it unsettling. It was simply the color of the sky now, and Ghost would sit beside him during those intervals, and they would both look at it without moving. Hunter found that this was enough. It was not what life had been, but it was something that belonged entirely to them, and in a world that had taken almost everything. That was not nothing. The second year changed the nature of things. Not dramatically. Not with any single turning point that Hunter could identify later and say that was the moment everything shifted. It was more like the difference between a man moving through a dangerous place and a man who had learned the dangerous place well enough to move through it deliberately. The fear was still there. He had no illusions about that. The fear was structural, built into the situation, and anyone who told you they had stopped being afraid in a world under alien occupation was either lying or had stopped processing reality accurately. But fear and function were not mutually exclusive, and Hunter had always been better than most at operating inside the first while maintaining the second. Ghost was 14 months old when the second year began in earnest, and he was a different animal than the white pup Hunter had carried in his jacket through the ruins of a hardware district. He was large now, larger than Hunter had expected, which he attributed to the wolf's genetics rather than any particular quality of the diet they had managed to maintain. His coat had come in thick and fully white, unmarked, which made him visually conspicuous in most environments, but which Hunter had stopped worrying about given that the aliens demonstrably did not register him as a threat or even as a presence worth noting. What mattered was Ghost's mind, which had developed with the same combination of intelligence and practicality that characterized everything about how the wolf approached the world. He was not obedient in the way a domesticated dog is obedient. He was something more like a partner who had evaluated the terms of the arrangement and found them acceptable. Hunter had spent the better part of a year building the communication between them, not training in the classical sense, but a shared vocabulary of gesture, sound, and movement that allowed them to coordinate with precision that Hunter found increasingly essential to how he operated. Ghost could range ahead and return with information Hunter could read in his posture and behavior before the wolf had come within speaking distance. He could hold a position in silence for periods that seemed to exceed what instinct alone would suggest, as though he understood the tactical requirement rather than just a command. He alerted to alien presence in a specific way, a particular stillness that was different from his regular stillness, a lowering of the head that Hunter had come to trust completely. It had not failed him once. What Hunter did in the second year was push. He had spent the first year learning his invisibility, testing its edges carefully, building confidence in small increments. In the second year, he began using it with intent. He moved into sectors that would have been suicide for any other person alive, crossing open ground in daylight, moving through active patrol zones, observing alien activity from distances that gave him detail no one watching from a safe perimeter could have gathered. He kept his notebook. He filled 3 more over the course of the year. Patrol rotations, unit types, the difference in behavior between ground sweeps and the more intensive search operations the aliens ran when they had reason to believe human presence was in an area. He noted what triggered escalation and what didn't, how long a heightened alert state lasted before units returned to routine pattern, the geography of the zones they seemed to prioritize versus the areas they passed through with less attention. It was the most comprehensive intelligence anyone had likely compiled on alien occupation behavior in this region, and he had nowhere to take it and no one to give it to, which was a fact he had made peace with in the same way he had made peace with most of the facts of his current life, by acknowledging it clearly and then continuing to function. The condition revealed itself to him more fully in the second year. He had always known its rough parameters, the slowing, the temperature drop, the way his vital signs would descend to a level that alarmed people who weren't expecting it. Way had not understood, until he began deliberately exposing himself to alien scanning technology, was how complete that descent actually was. He had an episode during a close observation of a major alien installation, a large structure the aliens had established in what had been a suburban logistics center about 60 kilometers from the old colony location. He had been watching the installation for 3 days from a concealed position when the slowing began, which was never convenient, but was also not something he could prevent. He had learned over a lifetime to manage it, get to a safe position, stay still, let it pass. He did that. What he noticed this time was that an aerial scan unit passed directly over his position at low altitude during the episode, the kind of pass that, based on everything he had observed, would flag even a well-concealed human as a detectable signature. It passed over him without response, not just without stopping. without any change in its scan pattern whatsoever, which meant he had not registered even as something worth a secondary look. He lay still after the episode passed and worked through the implications. During the slowing, his body temperature dropped significantly. He had measured it once with a thermometer from a rated pharmacy and had recorded a temperature of 93.4 degrees at what felt like the middle of a moderate episode, which was a number that would have sent a hospital into emergency protocols. His pulse slowed to a rate that a monitoring device would have classified as critical. Whatever the alien technology was scanning for, heat signatures, pulse frequencies, the bioelectric field that living human bodies generated. He was producing it at a level during those episodes that fell beneath whatever threshold their systems were calibrated to detect. And here was the thing that the second year of observation had clarified for him. He was always in a mild version of that state, not the full slowing, not the episodes that had frightened doctors and occasionally frightened him, but a baseline version of reduced output that apparently kept him perpetually beneath the alien detection threshold even when he was moving and active and fully functional. He was, by the measure of whatever the aliens were using to find humanity, not alive enough to register. He wrote this down in his notebook and then sat with Ghost in the fading orange light and thought about it for a long time. Ghost pressed against his side with the uncomplicated warmth of an animal that did not concern itself with existential implications, and Hunter found this helpful. Late in the second year, he found the settlement. He had been ranging through a section of the region he had not previously covered, pushing his mapping further east along what had been a freight rail corridor. Ghost ranged ahead, as was routine, and came back in a specific way that meant something worth investigating rather than something to avoid. Tail lower than neutral, gait purposeful, eyes on Hunter rather than on the environment behind him. Hunter followed him 1.5 kilometers along a ravine cut to where the rail line crossed a narrow river, and there found the remains of what had been a colony. It had been inside the infrastructure of a decommissioned rail maintenance depot. Good bones for a hidden settlement. Solid construction, multiple access points, the kind of structure that could house 30 or 40 people with reasonable comfort by current standards. It was not housing anyone anymore. The evidence of the sweep was several weeks old, maybe a month. The aliens had been thorough in the way Hunter had documented them being thorough when they found a settlement, systematic rather than explosive, the kind of clearance operation that suggested that they were looking for information about other populations as much as they were eliminating this one. He moved through the ruins carefully with Ghost at his heel, reading what had happened the way he had learned to read occupied territory, finding the story in the physical details. There were signs that some people had gotten out, a rear exit that had been used recently, tracks in the soft ground beyond it that led northeast before the terrain changed a hard surface and became unreadable. Not many people, but some. He crouched at the edge of the depot's main floor and looked at what was left and let himself feel the weight of it for a moment without pushing it away, because he had learned that pushing away only meant its surface later at less convenient times. Then he stood up, oriented northeast, and signaled Ghost to range ahead. They moved. He began to identify patterns within patterns. The alien ground units operated on rigid rotations, but there was a secondary layer of behavior that was not rigid at all, a responsive intelligence that adjusted when something flagged as unusual. It was not random improvisation. It was more like a system running diagnostics, checking anomalies, filing them, and moving on unless the anomaly repeated above a certain threshold. Hunter started thinking of it as a tolerance level. The aliens could absorb small irregularities and acted only on anything that exceeded it. A displaced piece of debris, a door that had shifted, a fresh footprint in soft ground. These triggered a brief intensification, and then a return to routine if nothing further confirmed the suspicion. He logged the threshold carefully. Understanding it meant he could operate right up to its edge without crossing it, which was exactly what he began to do. Ghost seemed to understand the edge, too. He had a way of moderating his own behavior in high observation zones that Hunter had never explicitly taught him, as though the wolf had run his own analysis and arrived at similar conclusions about where the boundary was. They made a good pair, Hunter thought. Two creatures who read the world carefully and moved through it accordingly. Foraging had become a skill in its own right by the second year. The supply caches from the early days of organized colony activity were increasingly depleted or compromised, and Hunter had shifted to sourcing almost everything from the environment directly. Game that Ghost would run down in the open ground sectors between alien patrol corridors. Plant material he had spent considerable time learning to identify. Water sources mapped against the alien infrastructure that contaminated some, but not all the natural channels. He was leaner than he had been at the colony, harder in ways that were not just physical. He had shed things that he had not known were excess until they were gone. Habits of thought, dependencies on routine and structure, and the presence of other people that he had not realized he was carrying until the weight of them lifted. He was not sure this was entirely a good thing. He was sure it was an honest thing, and in the absence of good he had found that honest was a reasonable substitute. The nights in the second year had a quality the first year nights hadn't. Quieter in the interior sense, if not always in the exterior one. He had stopped waiting for something to go wrong in a specific way. He had spent the first year waiting, that low-grade anticipatory tension of a man who does not yet trust his circumstances. The circumstances had not changed. The world was still occupied and hostile and indifferent to his survival, but it had changed enough inside it that the waiting had softened into something more like readiness, which was a different state entirely. Readiness was active. Waiting was just burning fuel. Ghost slept curled against his legs on the cold nights, and Hunter had long since stopped pretending this was purely practical, that he allowed it only because shared warmth was a survival calculation. It was that. It was also simply good, in the way that very few things still were, and Hunter was not so far gone that he couldn't recognize that. The third year began the way the second had ended, with movement, with purpose, with Ghost ranging ahead through terrain that would have stopped most people before they cleared the first kilometer. Hunter had changed the way he thought about distance. In the colony, distance had been measured in risk. How far could you go before the probability of encounter exceeded acceptable parameters? Out here, alone with 2 years of observation behind him and a wolf who could smell alien ground units before Hunter could see them, distance had become something closer to resource. The further he could move, the more he could know, and knowing was the only currency that had retained its value in a world where everything else had been restructured around survival and fear. Ghost was 2 years old and fully grown, and had settled into himself in the way that adult animals settle. Less energy spent on figuring out what he was, more energy available for everything else. He was not a large wolf by the measure of what the species had produced before the occupation, but he was not small either, and he moved with an efficiency that Hunter had spent considerable time studying, because it had practical implications for how they covered ground together. Ghost did not waste motion. Every movement served a purpose. Scouting, signaling, closing distance, creating space. Hunter had tried to incorporate this into his own movement and had achieved maybe 60% of it, which he considered a reasonable result given that he was working with a human body rather than one that had been engineered by several thousand years of necessary predation. They were 3 weeks into the third year when Hunter noticed the first change in alien behavior. He had been tracking a standard ground patrol through a sector he knew well, a wide industrial corridor that the aliens swept on a reliable 40-hour rotation, and the patrol did not move the way it was supposed to move. Instead of the standard lateral grid, it ran a tighter pattern, overlapping its own previous path in a way Hunter had not documented before. It was subtle. Anyone watching without his 2 years of baseline data would not have identified it as unusual. He identified it immediately and wrote it down and spent the evening sitting with Ghost going through his notebooks, looking for any previous instance of similar behavior. He found 2, both from the early second year, both in sectors he had subsequently observed being swept more aggressively in the weeks that followed. The correlation was not definitive, but it was there, and Hunter had learned to take correlations seriously when the cost of ignoring them was the kind of cost you only paid once. He began expanding his observation range, pushing into sectors he had mapped but not recently monitored, checking whether the pattern change was local to the corridor he had been watching or broader. It was broader. Over the following 3 weeks, he documented the same behavioral shift across 7 different patrol sectors, spanning a significant portion of the region he had been operating in. The patrols were tightening. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested immediate escalation, but consistently and in a direction that pointed towards something changing in how the alien occupation was prioritizing its ground activity in this area. He thought about the settlement he had found at the end of the second year, the rail depot, the evidence of a sweep that had been thorough and recent. He thought about the tracks leading northeast from the rear exit, the signs that some people had gotten out. He had followed those tracks as far as the terrain allowed and lost them on hard ground without finding where they led. He thought about what a tightening patrol pattern meant in the context of a settlement that had just been eliminated, whether the aliens were continuing to search for survivors from that specific group, or whether this was part of a broader operational shift. Both possibilities had implications. Neither was good. Ghost developed a new behavior in the third year that Hunter cataloged with the same attention he gave to alien patrol data. On 3 separate occasions, spread across the first 2 months, Ghost stopped during a routine range and turned back toward Hunter with a specific alert that was different from the alien presence alert. Not lower in focus, but upright and directed, oriented toward a fixed point in the distance rather than toward Hunter himself. The first 2 times Hunter followed the alert and found nothing he could identify as significant. Open ground, ruins, the ordinary texture of the wasteland. The third time Ghost held the alert for longer than usual, and Hunter pushed further in the indicated direction and found footprints. Human footprints. Recent ones, moving through a soft section of ground between 2 sections of collapsed road, heading in a direction that suggested whoever had made them was navigating by landmarks rather than by any map route. Someone who knew the area by observation rather than by plan. He followed them for the better part of the day, Ghost ahead and below in his tracking posture, until the terrain opened into a broad, flat section of what had been agricultural land, and he saw the figure, a person moving alone, carrying a pack that looked heavy by the way it was affecting their gait, heading toward a cluster of structures on a far side of the flat ground that Hunter recognized as a derelict grain processing facility. He watched for a while before moving. The figure did not move like someone who was lost. They moved like someone who had a destination and was conserving energy getting to it, which was a specific quality of movement that came from experience and not from luck. He signaled Ghost a heel and began crossing the flat ground at an angle that would bring him alongside the figure rather than behind them, because approaching someone from behind in the current world was the fastest way to get yourself killed by a person who had survived long enough to be jumpy. He covered half the distance before the figure stopped and turned. Not panicked. Deliberate. The turn of someone who had heard something and was assessing it rather than reacting to it. Hunter raised one hand. Open, palm out, which was the closest thing to a universal gesture remaining in a world that had lost most of its shared conventions. The figure did not run. They stood and watched him approach and Ghost come alongside him, and even at distance Hunter could see the assessment happening, the reading of him, the calculation of threat and intent that everyone still alive had learned to perform quickly and accurately. She was younger than he expected. Not young. Somewhere in her 30s, with a particular quality of someone who had been living hard for long enough that age had become secondary to condition. She had a knife in her hand that she had not raised and had not put away, which Hunter considered the appropriate response and thought well of. Her name was Petra. She had been out of the rail depot settlement for 31 days. She told him, when he had closed enough distance for conversation. She had been one of 11 people who made it through the rear exit, when the sweep hit. She did not know where the other 10 were now. The group had split in the chaos of the first night, and she had been moving alone since then, navigating by the mental map she had built during the settlement's scouting operations, looking for the location of a secondary shelter the settlement's leadership had identified before the sweep, but never fully established. She told him all of this with the directness of someone who had assessed him as not immediately dangerous, and decided that information sharing served her better than information hoarding, which was a calculation Hunter respected. He told her what he knew about the patrol pattern changes he had been documenting. He watched her process it. The specific focus of someone receiving tactically significant information and integrating it against what they already knew. She asked good questions. He answered them. Ghost sat between them during this exchange and watched Petra with the focused attention he gave to things he was still evaluating, which Hunter took as a neutral reading rather than a negative one. Ghost did not settle, which would have meant comfort, but he did not alert, which would have meant threat. Somewhere in the middle was where most things worth paying attention to lived. By the time the light had shifted to the evening, Orange Hunter had come to recognize they had covered enough ground between them that continuing to move separately seemed less logical than continuing to move together, at least for now. He did not say this directly. She did not say it directly. They simply both began moving toward the grain facility at the same time, and neither of them remarked on it, because some understandings in the current world were cleaner when they were left unspoken and allowed to simply be what they were. The grain facility was better than it looked from the outside, which was the best thing you could say about any shelter in the current world. The outer structure was deteriorated enough to read as abandoned even to a careful eye, but the inner processing rooms were intact. Concrete walls, a roof that held, drainage channels that still functioned and could be used to manage water without external exposure. Petra had been here before, briefly, during a scouting run from the depot settlement. She knew the layout well enough to move through it in low light without hesitation, which told Hunter something useful about the quality of her observation habits. They set a watch rotation without discussing it, the practical logic of two people who understood that sleeping without a watch was a way to not wake up. Hunter took first watch and sat in the upper level with a sight line across the flat ground they had crossed, Ghost beside him, thinking through what Petra's presence meant for how he was operating. He had been alone for 2 years and had made a kind of equilibrium out of it. Not comfort exactly, but functionality, the absence of other people become the baseline around which everything was calibrated. Another person disrupted that calibration in ways that were not necessarily bad, but were definitely real. Another person made noise, created a larger footprint, required coordination. Another person also meant another set of eyes, another set of skills, a division of cognitive load he had mostly stopped noticing until there was someone to share it with. He watched Ghost watching the flat ground and thought about the patrol pattern data and thought about the destroyed settlement and thought about 10 people scattered in the dark on the night of the sweep and wondered how many of them were still moving. Petra slept below with the solid unconsciousness of someone who had not felt safe enough to sleep deeply in a long time and was taking the opportunity, while it was available. Hunter let her sleep through the watch change and took the second rotation himself, because he needed less sleep than most people, and because it cost him nothing and gave her something she clearly needed. Ghost did not object to the extended watch. Ghost rarely objected to anything that involved sitting quietly in the dark looking at things, which was one of many qualities Hunter had come to appreciate about him. By morning, the understanding between Hunter and Petra had solidified into something practical without requiring discussion. They would move together toward the secondary shelter location she had been navigating toward. Hunter's patrol data made the route safer than she could have managed alone. Her knowledge of the local settlement network and its remaining members made the destination more valuable than a simple shelter. The math was simple, and they both knew it. Ghost accepted Petra with the measured tolerance he gave to most things that were not immediately dangerous. Not warmth yet, but the absence of hostility, which in Ghost's economy was endorsement enough. They moved out as the light came up, heading northeast, Ghost ranging ahead. The patrol data in Hunter's notebook pointed them through the gaps between tightening alien sweeps like a key fitted to a lock that nobody else knew existed. They found the colony 11 days after leaving the grain facility. It was not where Petra had expected it to be. The secondary shelter location her settlement's leadership had identified turned out to be occupied, but not in the way anyone had planned. The original site had been assessed as compromised by whoever arrived there first, and the colony had relocated 2 kilometers further northeast into a configuration of structures that Hunter would not have identified as a viable shelter from the outside, which was precisely the point. It was a cluster of connected maintenance buildings servicing what had been a regional power substation, low profile, partially underground, the kind of insulation that read as industrial debris from any distance, and offered nothing visually that would suggest habitation. Someone with a good, I had chosen it. Ghost found the perimeter before Hunter did, stopping and dropping into his alert posture with the specific orientation that meant human presence rather than alien, and Hunter put a hand on the wolf's back, and they both went still while Hunter read the ground ahead. The sentry was good, positioned in a place that used shadow and structural angles the way Hunter had been taught to use them, covering the most likely approach routes without creating an obvious profile. Hunter would have spotted the position eventually, but it would have taken him longer than it did, which he noted. Someone out here was teaching people properly. He raised his hand open, palm out, the same gesture he had used approaching Petra on the flat ground, and waited. Nothing happened for long enough that he began calculating alternatives. Then a voice came from a direction that was not where the sentry was positioned, which meant there were at least 2 of them, and the second one was better hidden than the first. The voice told him not to move, which he was already not doing, and asked him to identify himself. He gave his name. He said he had been in the wasteland for 3 years, and that he had patrol intelligence that the colony needed to hear. He said the woman beside him had been part of the rail depot settlement before the sweep. He said the wolf was not a threat, which he acknowledged sounded like exactly what someone would say if the wolf was a threat, but that it was true regardless. There was a pause that lasted long enough to be a conversation, happening somewhere he couldn't hear. Then he was told to approach slowly with his hands visible, leaving the wolf where it was. He looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at him with the expression of an animal that had opinions about being left behind but understood necessity. Hunter approached. They took his pack and his knife and walked him through a concealed entrance into the substation's primary underground level, and Hunter's first impression of the colony was of a place that had been organized by people who had survived long enough to understand that organization was itself a survival tool. It was not large. He counted approximately 50 people in the spaces he moved through, with the sense that there were more in sections he wasn't being taken through. It was not comfortable, but it was ordered in a way that the colony he had come from had taken months to achieve. Supplies were stored with clear system. The lighting was managed carefully, dim enough to prevent exterior bleed, but consistent enough to function by. People moved with the purposeful economy of a group that had established routines and understood why the routines mattered. He was taken to a woman named Voss. She was somewhere in her 50s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the particular quality of someone who had been making hard decisions for long enough that the weight of them had become posture rather than expression. She was the colony's operational lead, which Hunter understood to mean she was a person whose assessment of him would determine what happened next. She looked at him the way people looked at things they were deciding whether to trust, thoroughly and without apology. He looked back at her the same way, because anything else would have been a performance, and she would have read it as one. He told her what he had. Not everything, not immediately, but enough to establish that what he knew was real and specific, and not the kind of vague intelligence that desperate people sometimes inflated to buy themselves safety. He told her about the patrol pattern shifts he had been documenting over the previous weeks, the tightening rotations, the overlapping sweep paths, the correlation with previous observations of pre-escalation behavior. He told her about the rail depot settlement and the sweep, and watched her absorb that information with the stillness of someone who already half knew it and was simply receiving confirmation. She asked him how he had gathered patrol data at the proximity his descriptions implied. He told her about his condition. He kept it factual and brief, the medical reality, the baseline reduction in the biological outputs the alien detection technology appeared to be scanning for, the operational conclusion that the aliens could not find him the way they found everyone else. He watched her assess this the same way she had assessed everything else. Not with disbelief exactly, but with the careful skepticism of someone who had survived by not accepting things at face value. She asked him to demonstrate. He had anticipated this. He told her to send someone with him to a position with a sight line on the nearest patrol route and watch what happened when a unit passed. She sent a man named Briggs, broad, quiet, the kind of physical presence that suggested he had been chosen partly for what he would do if Hunter tried something during the demonstration. Hunter did not try anything. He walked Briggs to the position, a low ridge of debris 200 meters from the colony's perimeter that gave a clean sight line on the corridor the nearest patrol used. They waited 20 minutes for a unit to come through. When it did, Hunter stood up, full height, open ground, the patrol unit approximately 60 meters away and scanning. Briggs, beside him, made a sound that was not quite a word. The unit swept its scanner array across their position and kept moving. Hunter sat back down. Briggs said nothing for a moment, and then said that he needed to tell Voss what he had just seen, which Hunter thought was a correct response. The reception in the colony did not become warm after the demonstration. It became something more complex than either hostility or welcome, a suspended state of people who were trying to calculate what Hunter's existence meant for them, and had not yet arrived at a conclusion. He understood this. He was something outside their experience, outside the framework of how survival worked in the occupied world, and things outside frameworks made people in survival situations uncomfortable for the same reason that surprises made them uncomfortable. Surprises in the current world tended to be the bad kind. Ghost was brought inside the perimeter on the second day, which Hunter had not pushed for and was quietly relieved about. The wolf's presence in the colony produced a range of reactions that Hunter observed with interest, wariness from most, the particular fascination of people who had not seen an animal that large and that calm in a long time, and from a small number of the colony's younger members, something that Ghost himself seemed to recognize and respond to, allowing approaches he did not allow from adults, accepting brief contact with a tolerance that Hunter had not previously documented. It helped. He could see it helping. The wolf functioning as a kind of proof of something that his words alone might not have established, that Hunter was a person who had been in the wasteland for 3 years and come out of it with something intact rather than just depleted. Petra moved through the colony with more ease than Hunter did. She had the social currency of being a known quantity, a survivor of a settlement people had heard of, carrying information about people some of them knew. She was integrating. Hunter was still being evaluated. On the 4th day, Voss called him back and told him she had been thinking about what he had described in the patrol pattern changes and wanted to walk through his data in detail. He brought his notebooks. They spent 3 hours going through them, and Hunter watched Voss build the same picture he had built, arriving at the same conclusions through her own analysis rather than accepting his, which told him everything he needed to know about how she operated, and confirmed that the colony was in better hands than most. At the end of the 3 hours, Voss told him that based on what his data showed, the colony had perhaps 3 weeks before the tightening sweep pattern reached their sector. She said this with the steadiness of someone delivering a fact rather than a verdict, and then she looked at him and asked him what he thought they should do about it. He had been thinking about that for longer than he had been in the colony. He told her what he thought they should do was not move. Every instinct a frightened person had in a situation like this pointed toward relocation. Pick up and go. Find somewhere new. Put distance between themselves and the incoming sweep. Hunter had watched that instinct get people killed. Movement in the occupied world was exposure, and exposure was what the alien detection technology was designed to exploit. A colony of 50 people relocating through active patrol territory was 50 people's worth of biosignatures moving through a landscape that was increasingly calibrated to find exactly that. The math was bad. Staying had its own risks, but they were risks that could be managed with good information and careful preparation, which was precisely what he had to offer. Voss listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she asked him how confident he was in the patrol data, not as a challenge, but as a genuine assessment question, the kind you asked when you were about to make a decision based on someone else's analysis and needed to calibrate how much weight to give it. He told her he was confident in the pattern and less certain about the timeline, that 3 weeks was his best reading of the escalation curve, but that the aliens had surprised him before, and he built his planning around the assumption that they would surprise him again. She appreciated that answer. He could tell because she stopped assessing him and started talking to him as a resource rather than a variable, which was a different quality of conversation entirely. The harder problem was the colony itself. Voss could make decisions and the colony would follow them. She had that kind of authority, earned rather than assumed. But Hunter was aware that a plan built around his condition and ghost abilities required the colony to trust both of those things, and trust in the current world was not extended on the basis of a demonstration and a set of notebooks. There were people in the colony who looked at him the way his old colony had looked at him in those final weeks, not with hostility, but with a particular discomfort of someone who does not know what to do with a thing that doesn't fit their understanding of how the world works. He was used to that look. He did not take it personally, and he did not let it change what he knew needed to happen. Ghost seemed to understand that something was shifting in the situation. He stayed closer to Hunter than usual during those days inside the colony. Not anxious, not alert in the alien detection sense, but present in the specific way he got when he was paying close attention to something he hadn't fully resolved yet. Hunter found the wolf's company steadying in the way he always had. Whatever came next, they had faced worse ground than this and come through it. He held on to that and let it be enough. The plan took 4 days to build and 2 more to argue about, which Hunter considered a reasonable ratio. Voss ran the colony with the kind of practical democracy that survival situations produce when they produce good leadership. Decisions were made by the person with the most relevant knowledge, but that person was expected to show their work and withstand challenge before anything was committed to. Hunter showed his work. He laid out the patrol data, the behavioral patterns, the tolerance threshold he had identified, and spent 2 years operating inside of, and the specific geometry of how the incoming sweep was going to move through their sector based on everything he had observed about how the aliens ran escalation operations. He answered every challenge put to him by the colony's senior members, and there were good challenges. People who had been surviving in the occupied world long enough to have their own frameworks and their own data, and who were not willing to abandon those frameworks on the basis of one man's notebooks, no matter how detailed those notebooks were. He respected this. He incorporated the challenges where they improved the plan and held his ground where they didn't. And by the end of the second day of argument, the plan was better than it had been at the start, which was how argument was supposed to work. The core of what he proposed was straightforward. The sweep would move through their sector in a pattern that his data predicted with reasonable confidence. The colony would not move. Instead, they would go completely dark. No movement. No heat signatures, nothing that crossed the alien detection threshold for the duration of the sweep's passage through their immediate area, which his best estimate put at a window of approximately 14 hours. The problem was that 50 people going completely dark for 14 hours in an underground installation was not straightforward. People generated heat. People moved. Children made noise. The sick and the elderly produced irregular bioelectric output that could not be managed the way healthy adults could be managed. The plan had to account for all of this, and accounting for it required a level of detail and coordination that pushed the colony's organizational capacity to its edge. Hunter spent 3 days working through the specifics with Voss and a small group of the colony's most experienced members. They identified the individuals whose biological output was most likely to create detection risk, and built the plan around managing those risks first. Insulating materials were sourced and layered to reduce heat bleed from the installation's interior. Movement protocols were established with a 14-hour window, who could move, where, when, and how. A communication system was worked out that used physical signals rather than sound, adapted from the gesture vocabulary Hunter had developed with Ghost over 3 years alone. Ghost's role in the plan was the part that generated the most resistance and ultimately the most acceptance. Hunter proposed using Ghost to provide advance warning of the sweep's actual arrival, not the predicted arrival based on patrol data, but the real-time confirmation that the units were entering their sector and the window was beginning. Ghost could detect alien ground units at a distance, and with a reliability that no mechanical sense of the colony possessed could match. And he could do it without creating any of the detection risks that an active electronic sensor would generate. Briggs, who had watched Ghost perform on patrol route demonstration and had been one of the plan's more thoughtful skeptics, was the one who made the case for this to the rest of the senior group. Hunter had not asked him to. He noted it and filed it as information about Briggs that might be useful later. The 2 weeks before the sweep were the most operationally dense Hunter had experienced since before the occupation, which was a comparison he found quietly remarkable. There was a version of what he was feeling that he recognized from his old life. The focus of a person working toward a specific outcome with other people who were working toward the same thing. The particular quality of shared purpose that he had not realized he missed until it was suddenly present again. He did not examine it too closely. There was work to do, and examining feelings was not work. He ran 3 more scouting passes through the approaching sweep corridor in the days before it arrived, each time moving through active patrol territory with Ghost ranging ahead and his notebooks open, refining the timeline and the pattern prediction with each additional data point. What he found on the 3rd pass changed his estimate. The sweep was larger than his previous data had suggested. Not catastrophically larger, not a different kind of operation than it planned for, but broader in its lateral extent, which meant the 14-hour window was likely to be closer to 18, and meant that the outer edge of the sweep would pass closer to the colony's perimeter than the plan had originally accounted for. He came back and told Voss immediately. She absorbed the revision with the steadiness he had come to expect from her and asked what needed to change. They worked through it that night, the 2 of them and Briggs, adjusting the insulation placement and the movement protocols for the extended window. It was not a small adjustment. It required renegotiating several of the arrangements they had already put in place with specific colony members, and renegotiating arrangements with frightened people under time pressure was its own particular kind of work. They managed it. The sweep arrived on a Tuesday, 17 days after Hunter had first laid out the plan to Voss. Ghost alerted at first light. The full stillness, head dropping, body orienting northeast, and Hunter passed a signal through the colony's communication chain, without sound, and the 14-hour protocol became the 18-hour protocol, without anyone needing to be told twice, because they had rehearsed both. Hunter positioned himself at the colony's outermost monitoring point, a concealed position in the upper structure of the substation that gave him a sight line on the sweep's approach corridor. Ghost was beside him. Below, 50 people were doing what 50 people had to do to disappear, managing their breathing and their movement, and their fear with the discipline of people who understood that discipline was the difference between alive and not. The first alien units came into his sight line 40 minutes after Ghost's alert. They moved in the formation Hunter had predicted, a broad lateral line with overlapping scan coverage, methodical and thorough in a way that alien sweeps were always methodical and thorough. He watched them work the corridor and felt the same sharpened clarity he felt on that open ground in the early days, standing with Ghost at his feet, while a patrol moved toward him and trusting in something he could not entirely explain. The difference was that this time he was not trusting it on behalf of himself alone. The sweep took 4 hours to pass through the primary corridor. The outer edge of the formation came within 80 meters of the colony's perimeter, which was closer than a revised plan had accounted for, and further than Hunter let himself think about in real time, because there was nothing productive in that direction. Ghost did not move. Hunter did not move. Below them, nobody moved. The scanner swept the substation's exterior and found nothing worth stopping for, and kept going, and the formation moved on through the sector with the indifferent efficiency of a system that had not been given a reason to look harder. Hunter stayed at the monitoring position for 2 hours after the last unit cleared his sight line. Then he went below and told Voss it was done. She nodded. She did not celebrate, which he had not expected her to, and she did not thank him effusively, which he had not wanted. She looked at him for a moment with a direct assessment she gave everything, and then she said that the colony was going to need his patrol data on an ongoing basis, and that there was a bunk in the east section that was currently unoccupied if he wanted it. It was not a warm welcome. It was a practical offer from a practical person to a practical person, which was a language Hunter had been speaking for 3 years and understood better than warmth in any case. He said he would think about it. He went and found a quiet section of the upper structure where Ghost could sit beside him without anyone needing to navigate around them, and they both looked out at the corridor the sweep had moved through, now empty and ordinary in the late afternoon light. He thought about the colony he had walked out of 3 years ago. He thought about the 7 people whose names he had listed in the main hall on the morning he came back alone, and who he still listed sometimes in the quiet, because they deserved to be remembered by someone who had been there. He thought about what it cost to get here, not in the dramatic accounting of sacrifice and suffering, but in the smaller and more honest accounting of what 3 years alone in the occupied world actually was. Day by day, decision by decision, the 10,000 small choices that added up to still being alive when the odds had never particularly favored it. Ghost pressed against his side with the solid warmth of an animal that had grown up in the wasteland and did not know any other world, and had made something good out of it anyway. Hunter put a hand on the wolf's back and left it there. He had not decided yet about the bunk in the east section. He thought he probably would. Below, the sounds of normal activity were beginning to return. Carefully at first, the waste sound returns to a space held in silence, testing itself before committing. Voices, movement, the particular texture of people exhaling a tension they had been holding for 18 hours straight. He could hear from up here, and it was not an unpleasant sound. It was a sound of 50 people still being alive who had, by every conventional measure how the occupied world worked, no particular right to be. The plan had not been perfect. 3 people in the colony's lower section had experienced symptoms during the window that required managing: elevated temperature in one case, a panic response in another, a child who had needed to be held in complete silence for 4 of the 18 hours by a mother whose arms Hunter suspected were still shaking. These were not failures. They were the honest cost of executing something difficult under conditions that did not permit error, paid by people who had been paying similar costs every day and would pay them again, because that was what surviving in the occupied world required. Briggs found him in the upper structure as the light was going to orange. The large man sat down nearby without ceremony and looked out at the same empty corridor Hunter was looking at and said nothing for a while, which Hunter appreciated. Then Briggs said that there were people in the colony who had come from a settlement to the northwest that had been swept 8 months ago, and that what had happened today was the first time since then that they had had a reason to believe that surviving the next sweep was something other than a matter of luck and timing. He said this the way people stated facts, when the facts were large enough that embellishment would only make them smaller. Hunter did not respond immediately. He thought about the rail depot and the tracks leading northeast and the 10 people scattered in the dark, and about Petra moving to the colony below them with something approaching ease, and about the notebooks in his pack that contained 2 years of data that had just proven its value in the most direct way possible. He thought about what it meant to have something worth giving, and somewhere to give it. Ghost shifted beside him, resettling with a long exhale, and Briggs looked at the wolf and then looked back at the corridor and the three of them sat together in the fading light and let the day be what it was.